What works and what doesn't. This is an outlook for 2025. It's January 1st, 2025. Happy New Year's, everybody. It's New Year's Day. We're traveling in Europe actually right now in Zurich, just next to the lake. It's freezing cold and foggy and typical winter weather here in Switzerland, which reminds me why I actually moved to California. But that's not the topic of this episode. The topic of this episode is a little bit of a tradition now. We try to sort of summarize the year and go for the next year, what works and what doesn't. Keep it simple. Before I go there, the performance for the year, 87.8%. The market was up 23.6. We're outperforming by 64.2%, excuse me, 64.2%. That's the outperformance. Excellent year. We're driven by NVIDIA and Tesla. We had a pretty difficult first half of the year with a very strong second half, driven by the election results and market fury that came after that. In particular, for Tesla, NVIDIA has been doing well throughout the year because the company is delivering on the numbers, and the AI demand for training is very strong, and NVIDIA is the market leader in that space. Now, let's talk about what works and what doesn't. So 3 things that work, 3 things that don't work. Like I said, keep it simple. Of course, there's lots of ifs and whens and buts, and then you could add this and you could add that. It's like everything else. If you want to have the best movie of the year, if you want to have the best UFC fighter of the year, if you want to have the best soccer player of the year, it's always going to be, well, no, but you should also mention this one and that one and this and that. The same here. So we don't want to complicate it too much. So this is where we stand today. So the 3 things that work, one is Trump. And what I mean with Trump in particular is DOGE and regulation. The second is AI and space. And the third is Bitcoin. What doesn't work is debt, inflation, debt and fragile US dollar, inflation, and AI dislocating people. So those are the 3 things that don't work. Let's start with what works. Okay, so Trump has been elected, and why is that such a good thing for the financial markets? There's 2 particular things that we outline. One is more macro, and one is, I'd say, in a sense, macro too, but it's more micro because it affects actual companies on a daily business. So the macro is DOGE, right? If we can reduce the inefficiencies of government, if we can reduce waste, if we can reduce corruption, then that will have positive spillover effects into the economy. The same way corruption has negative spillover effects into the economy, corruption also has positive spillover effects into the economy, and that's what the purpose of DOGE is. For people who are not familiar, DOGE stands for Department of Government Efficiency, and the idea of government efficiency is really, one, of course, to lower the expenses and therefore to lower the deficit, but it's more than that. It's also reduce corruption and reduce regulatory capture, and the 4th branch of government, the unelected bureaucrats that take power into their own hands. That's the fundamental idea, and that is going to have positive spillover effects onto the economy. So that's the first thing that works. The second thing, AI and space, we put that together because they're both innovative technologies that are now spilling over into the broader sense of the economy. AI means that we have found a way to, in unsupervised way, learn at scale and represent knowledge at scale, and then use that to inference for things like, for example, code development, for writing, for design. And going forward, we will also develop techniques for understanding physics. So in other words, go from 1 dimension text into 4 dimensions, which is the 3 dimensions plus time, and then hopefully have similar unsupervised, generalized effects that allow us to do inference on physics. one case study that is, I think, hopefully encompasses the power of this is that we could see, hopefully, at some point in the near future, in virtue development of physical systems. So if you want to build a car, you can develop the car in terms of inverse design. So meaning you can specify the features that you want of a car, light, sturdy, energy efficiency, things along those lines. And you can then have AI-driven suggested composition of the car, the materials, the way it's engineered, all of these things based on an AI that can basically iterate at a much, much faster scale than an engineer and offer a ready for tape out solution that then certainly has to be trimmed and prototyped and improved, but fundamentally actually is already a pretty good situation. So very similar to chip design. This is paraphrasing Jensen Huang. And this, in our opinion, has tremendous impact on the economy, because we could see, development cycles for things like rockets, airplanes, houses, construction, go from years to months, weeks, maybe even days. Faster iteration in compute space allows for more error correction, faster innovation. Innovation is, in a sense, just error correction or a way to iterate faster. Now, in order to do that, first, of course, you have to have the will to iterate, which is a cultural thing. The difference between Silicon Valley and many other places is not the money, it's not the talent, it's just the will to iterate, the will to fail. If we could do this in virtue, then the will to fail and the will to iterate will pretty much be, ubiquitous, because it will be very cheap to fail, and then you can iterate much faster. So that's what AI promises, and that has repercussions, of course, on training. We believe that the era of pre-training is not over, not unlike Ilya Sutskever said. We believe that it's actually just starting now, because we're going from 1 dimension to 4 dimension, which will have an exponential amount of training necessity. And then, of course, O1 and O3 and those types of endeavors, which is inference, also will become a lot more involved, expensive, and semantic, and therefore we will have more demand on these systems. NVIDIA is very well positioned. That doesn't mean that other companies and other technologies should or can't succeed, but we also see the advantage of NVIDIA in many ways. Now, we don't want to say, like, look, we don't see, of course we don't see. If we saw a competitor now, then that company would be worth hundreds of billions of dollars, NVIDIA would be worth a lot less. So it's obviously we don't see it. The point is, you can't see around the corner, but what you can is predict roughly, given the information today, what could happen. So what we know today is the following. NVIDIA has the best software stack that helps parallelize training. That's what NVIDIA has. That's why it's so successful. Now, that can be translated into parallelizing inference, and we believe that NVIDIA has a very good position for that too, and that's the key, right? If you want to do inference at scale and training at scale, you need to find ways to parallelize at scale. And that's where NVIDIA stands as a market leader today. Space travel is another thing that we think has massive potential, in particular because it is transportation, of course, but it's also telecommunication, namely SpaceX. Now, why is that so important? Well, if you can travel faster and communicate faster and cheaper, then that leads to massive economic growth. By the way, for us investors, these types of macro calls are incredibly important for two reasons. One is, of course, that you have sectors that you can invest in. But second, it's also important to understand what kind of economic impact this will have. If you can improve productivity by 10% in a $100 trillion economy, you create $10 trillion of value. You might either create that or you might save that. So that means, other things don't have to be spent. It's not that important how exactly the money flows in. What's important is that the money will, look, this is real. This is not something we believe in. This is for real. If you can do 10% better at something, you have 10% more time to do other things. Therefore, you're more productive. Just look at yourself. if you have a washing machine for your dishes, you just save time washing dishes. You can do something else. And no matter what you do, even if you just watch Netflix movies, that will add to Netflix's budget and therefore creates value in the economy. So that's the second thing that works. The third thing that works is Bitcoin. What we mean with Bitcoin is that we have now, for the first time, a valid alternative to the US dollar as a global reserve currency, and that's good in many ways. First, we have an option to go away from inflationary spending, but more importantly, also it puts pressure on the US dollar, actually, and the people who are in charge of the US dollar to stop wasting away with the money. So that's the good thing. The bad thing, we will discuss this later on, because there's also a risk here, of course, which is what if the US dollar actually loses its reserve currency status? That could have repercussions on the financial markets. So that's the negative. We'll talk about this in a second. But still, on the positive side, this is a good thing, because if we didn't have, look, we have a soft budget constraint in the United States because the US is the global reserve currency, and because of things like what Ben Bernanke did in 2008 and opening the Pandora's box, and all kinds of things have happened since, particularly since 2008, that have led to massive $1 trillion deficits, and 36 trillion in debt, and so on and so forth, things that are just absolutely unsustainable. The Bitcoin situation is therefore incredibly important as a counterbalance. So this is the three things that work: AI, Bitcoin, and Trump. What doesn't work? Let's start with what doesn't work. We have high debt and high inflation. Inflation is not abating, particularly where it matters: housing, academia, and healthcare. Those are things that everybody has to spend. If you don't spend on these things, then you're just not going to live a civilized life, at least not in the United States. It's impossible to avoid these things. You can try to some extent, maybe on the education side. You have options like the UC system in California. Lots of public universities around the country are an option, particularly if you want to study STEM. But nevertheless, it's still, you can't just say, you can avoid. The same with healthcare insurance, healthcare services are going through the roof. Now, the positive side there is that because there's so much corruption in the system, there's also a lot of low-hanging fruit in terms of getting rid of those costs. But still, that is a big problem. So high debt, high inflation, high government spending. We are relying on Donald Trump to lower that, and it's not so straightforward whether Trump can actually lower those costs. Now, having said that, we believe that there is at least hope that DOGE and regulatory environment will improve, so we can outgrow some of that debt, and then also with DOGE reduce it. But again, this is certainly a risk. The second risk is actually the inverse of the positive Bitcoin side. What if the US dollar actually loses its reserve currency status? What kind of repercussions will this have for the US dollar, and what does this mean for the financial markets? In other words, could we have a situation where one morning we wake up and people start dumping US dollars en masse for Bitcoin, and Bitcoin goes from 100,000 to 1 million or something, like something along the lines of what happened with the Lebanese pound? Could this happen to the US dollar? Of course, nobody envisions something like that, but we're talking about markets here. We're talking about millions of people acting in discoordinated ways. Yes, it is kind of coordinated because it's a market, but everybody makes their own decisions. And what if everybody starts doing the same thing at the same time? These are risks that we have to consider when we have a new reserve currency such as Bitcoin. If that happens, and that happens, usually when these things happen, they happen fast. When the dollar becomes the de facto national currency of Argentina, like for example, when Argentina devalued their currency, then when these things happen, they happen fast. They don't happen gradually. So that's a risk we have to envision. Now, for us, as Orange Capital Partners, the way we're positioned in this whole situation is that we believe that, well, first we have some Bitcoin, of course, which will help us, but there's a good chance that if you could have an Argentina scenario, the dollar just loses a lot of value relative to Bitcoin. The actual real value of companies like Tesla and Nvidia shouldn't change. It just will go up a lot in dollars and be worth the same in Bitcoin. So that's kind of the way we see it. But nevertheless, it's a risk. Now, the third risk, that's a social risk, and that is, again, the inverse of the positive. Like if AI happens the way we think it will happen, it will dislocate a lot of people. And that's definitely not the people's fault. We have economies that are relatively rigid. People, just the lives of people themselves are just rigid. I mean, you go through life, you educate yourself, you learn things, you work somewhere, and then all of a sudden there's an AI that can do the same job that you have been doing for years now, much better than you've been doing. So it's absolutely normal that your boss will replace you with an AI. But what are you going to do? Go drive an Uber? We can't even drive an Uber because that's going to be taken over by AI also. So what the hell are people supposed to do? And those are important questions that have not been answered. Basic income, things like that. Those are not solutions because people need dignity, people need work. They don't need just money. Money is important, but that's not the only thing. So I think universal basic income is really not the solution here. That would be my suggestion. But that's not even the question here, or the conversation that we're having right now is simply about risks. And when we talk about risks, we have to understand what that means for our portfolio. We could have, let's say, a backlash again, a la, during COVID, Black Lives Matter, wokeism could come back. Wokeism is the new Bolshevism. Let's just leave it at that. It's a risk to capitalism. It's a risk to the culture of the West, of error correction and Popperian sort of approximation towards truth and all those things. That's the risk. The values of the Enlightenment are at risk. People will question those things when they lose their dignity. They have no incentive. If you lose your job, if you lose your purpose as a person, whatever that purpose was, whatever you think you had, and you lose that, and if it's just showing up at 8 a.m. at work and now you don't, and let's say you even have the money, right? Let's say somehow the government takes care of you, you still will start questioning this whole system, and then wokeism comes out, and which again is the new Bolshevism. And what I mean with that is, what Bolshevism did is really undo the natural economic forces, which leads to lots of suffering, and that's the problem. We could lose money, but even worse, we could lose our livelihoods, and you could lose even more than that. So those are the risks that we have to be conscious about, right? And as portfolio managers, there's really only limited things we can do here. Invest in company. Our degree of freedom is we have access to capital, and it's our job to deploy that capital into productive forces. It's not our job to finance social programs or something like that. The question is whether it's even anybody's job to do that, because we don't really know what to do in the first place. Nevertheless, again, we have to be conscious of these things and just take them as risks. Again, these are risks. We don't have solutions to the risks, nor do we have solutions to the positives in terms of like, okay, well, this is what you should be investing in. Just to remind everybody, this is not investment advice. Please do your own work. The purpose of this podcast is to give people a sense of what it feels like to run a hedge fund, and understanding the positives and the risks at the big picture is certainly part of what we do here at Orange Capital Partners, and therefore also hopefully helps our listeners to better navigate the system, the financial system that they're operating in. Thank you.